April 2007, another book about Vietnam once again struck the attention of American readers. Perfect Spy, an incredible double life of Phạm Xuân Ẩn. And in October, the book was translated into Vietnamese and became the bestsellers list. The author of the book is Professor of History, writer Larry Berman. Berman's book appears 32 years after the war, yet, amazingly, adds significantly to Americans' understanding of what happened during the American War in Vietnam. In Perfect Spy, Professor Larry Berman chronicles the extraordinary life of one of the 20th century's most fascinating spies. The book tells a compelling story of a proud warrior who did what he had to do for his country. He did it well. Within only 4 months after its publication, over 20,000 copies have been sold out, a record in history books in the U.S.
Hello and welcome to Talk Vietnam. Today's show is a very special one, and we have the honor of inviting Professor Larry Berman to the program. He is the author of The Perfect Spy, the incredible double life of Phạm Xuân Ẩn, who we'll talk about later on the program. But today he's going to share with us his journeys in writing the book, as well as talk about his experience speaking with Mr. Ẩn himself, and also his experience as a professor in history at the University of California, Davis. So thank you, Professor Larry Berman, for joining us on the program today.
I am delighted to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Taking the time in your busy schedule, I know that. I first want to just get into, there have been other authors who've written about Phạm Xuân Ẩn, and for one is Jean-Claude Piemonte, who wrote Quiet Vietnamese. Also, Thomas A. Bass wrote the article Spy Who Loved Us. Vietnamese author Ngọc Hai, who wrote Phạm Xuân Ẩn, his name and his life. Now, Perfect Spy, how do you see that it's different from the other publications?
That's a great question. I am On's official biographer. That is, for over 20 years, many people had wanted to write about On, and On had said no. And he said no for many reasons. Jean-Claude Piemonte, the book you mentioned, it's an interesting book, but of course he and On were friends and they were journalists during the war, and there's almost no real research being done in that book. The Bass article is just a short article, but in my case, I was able to convince On at a late stage in his life that an American historian should write his story. It was very important that both the Vietnamese and the Americans hear that story. And I think my book differs from the amount of research I did, and because it was authorized by On himself.
So he gave his blessing to do the book, as well as your personal interaction with him makes your book different. You first met Phạm Xuân Ẩn in 2001. Can you just give us your initial impression of him?
Yes, I met him. He walked into a restaurant that I had been invited for a dinner party in which there were 20 people already seated, and there was only one empty seat, and it was directly across from me, the way you and I are sitting.
That's kind of lucky, as I would say.
And everyone spoke Vietnamese at the table, and I don't speak Vietnamese, so it was going to be a very long evening, and I was already hoping the beer would be cold. And On walked in, and our host, Jim Reckner, said, "Hello, General On," and On said in English, "I'm sorry I'm late, I was delayed." And there was only one seat. He sat down, and he introduced himself as Phạm Xuân Ẩn, and I said, "My name is Larry Berman. I'm a professor from the University of California, Davis." And he said, "Davis? That's right near Sacramento. I interned in the Sacramento Bee." And for the next 3 hours, we discussed On's time in America, his life, and all of his famous reporter friends, David Halberstam, Neil Sheehan, and the like. But he never once mentioned that he was also someone else, that he had another history. He never mentioned it. But we had a delightful time, and he asked me to see him the next day to talk about my book, No Peace, No Honor, and that established the beginning of our relationship. I found him to be a very interesting, witty man with a great sense of humor, very engaging, and his mind was very sharp.
Now, as your relationship progressed with him, how, did your idea of him, mentality of him change along with that?
Well, when I first met On, he was really the first Vietnamese intelligence agent I'd ever spoken to, and his English was very good. And so for me, there were two good things about this. First of all, he had a lot of knowledge about the war. He had his English was great, so I didn't need an interpreter, and he and I could talk about a whole range of things. Right. At first, I was very impressed by what I think almost all of his friends were impressed about, that he was engaging, that he could carry a conversation. He had this great sense of Vietnamese history and tradition, and also an understanding of the Americans. And if you took the time to listen, On had a lot to say, and he helped teach me quite a bit before I ever began this project, before he ever told me I could write the book of his life. He taught me a lot about Vietnam, Vietnamese culture, but also how much he benefited from his experiences in America, and how much he benefited from his friendships with Americans.
Would you say that, from his teachings you about the Vietnamese culture and Vietnam's history, it gave you kind of a foundation to write his story?
It did provide me with an essential foundation. I had written 4 books actually on Vietnam before I met On, but I thought that I knew Vietnam. But when I met On, I realized that I really, for all I saw, I really understood very little, and he helped me to bridge that necessary gap to write a book through the eyes of a Vietnamese hero and an American journalist, what the war was all about.
Now, 2001 was when you met him, and it wasn't until 2003 that he gave you the green light to write this autobiography, or this biography, I'm sorry. So what was it? Many people, he didn't give permission to anyone else prior to that to write his story, but he gave it to you. Now, how did you go about persuading him?
Well, I tried every persuasive mechanism possible, and he kept saying no and no. And then On became gravely ill, and there was a picture of him. I was in Saigon at the time, and there was a picture of him in the hospital with an oxygen mask over his face. And it said that General Phạm Xuân Ẩn is near death. He has emphysema in his lungs. And I wrote On a long letter expressing my hopes that he would cheat death because he had cheated death so many other times in his life. Being a spy, there were many close calls that he really had. And I said, I hope one day we can see each other again. I thought he would never see the letter. And a few months later, I received word that he was home, and that he would like me to come and visit him, and that he would like me to bring him 3 books. He was always asking me to bring him books to read. Now, when I got to Ho Chi Minh City and I called on at his home, he was very frail. He didn't look very well. His mind was still as sharp as ever. And I beseeched him. I said to him, look, I said, you only have a short time to live. He thought he only had about 6 months. And I said, your story needs to be told. It is an amazing story. And it should be told by an American historian, someone who didn't know you as a friend during the war, someone who has written an objective series of books. And On looked at me and he said, okay, you're right. And I had an immediate sense of I've got to get this done because he could die tomorrow. And of course, On lived for 3 years, but I didn't know he would live for 3 years. So I made 20 trips to Vietnam, literally almost every month. I would come for 2 weeks, go back to the States, write everything up, come back again. I took a year sabbatical, and he kept going and going. And so I was able in the 3 years to have access that I'm sure at the beginning he never thought we would have 3 years together.
Right.
Yeah.